Well, greetings, people. Dr. Martin Glynn, aka Doc Martin. I'm interviewing Craig Pinkney, good friend, good brethren. Most of the people watching this, wherever you're watching it from, will know Craig. Just brief. Craig's been a youth worker. Moved on to lecturing, and I suppose the natural progression now is academia. Today's interview is not really focused on a biography. If people want to know more about Craig, myself, there's many videos and stuff, but tonight is something a bit more fundamental. I suppose if I was giving it a title for tonight, I'd call it Bridging the Gap. So Craig, listen, it's good we haven't met up for a while. I know you've just come back from Jamaica, so I mean, what might be good is to kind of start with the recent trip to Jamaica, because there's lots of questions I want to ask. But I mean, I remember when you was invited to Jamaica and I saw you fiery in Jamaica. Can you just very briefly kind of talk a little bit about the trip you had to Jamaica and one of the questions I keep getting asked, because for me, I mean, the fire, the passion. What is it that happened in Jamaica to make you the way you was?
I think for me, the reason why that fire was there was I felt like I was going home. With any event, any issue that I've ever been called to deal with, Jamaica was weird in a sense because I was amongst my people, seeing family members talking about issues on the island and having that opportunity to work with the people, for me, it brought something out of me. But I think what it also brought out of me is my academic level, to be able to contextualize a situation. So for me, it was about bringing my A game.
But how did it all come about? Because
I think, I've said it before, for people that don't know, I was literally popped into my LinkedIn inbox and I seen an email from a lady from America that is now the restorative justice coordinator in Jamaica, and said that they're thinking about doing an event around restorative justice, as Jamaica has taken on this approach around restorative justice, and would I be interested in coming? A couple of weeks after that, I watched in the news that there was a announcement that the Prime Minister of Jamaica said that there's a state of emergency in Montego Bay, St. James. So I got another email to say, Craig, I think that you need to come based on your expertise and knowledge and whatnot. And it kind of happened quite quickly. So what my initial task was, and what it then became, was two different things. So when I arrived in the country, I was literally at work. So the first day I was meeting with the people from the community, people that were upset, people that wanted to help, people that didn't have no clue what was going on. So speaking to those people and then going on national TV, for me was a beginning of something that I felt that was going to be impactful long term. So then following that particular session I had with the individuals out there, were telling me about issues about violence and corruption and politics and the dons, and issues around embalming fluid and issues around systematic violence within the country. So I had to take a step back and not do the traditional workshop type of inspiring type of thing, and I had to bring my criminology hat, but not just a normal hat that I'm recognised for, but more importantly, what I call, bridging the gap between academia and the streets, and showing them that despite there's homicides, despite there's murder, despite that there's madness in the community, there are children of the diaspora that have a vested interest in, one, understanding what's going on, but two, we also can help. So for me, it wasn't about going to Jamaica with a magic pill or a magic bottle of water to say, here, I have something, deal with the issue and you can somewhat deal with the problems based on what I've said. Rather, it was about embedding myself within a context that was, one, strange, two, that was secondary to home, but three, I had an emotional connection. So for me, it was really about how do I use my knowledge and expertise from my vantage point of a child of the diaspora and bring that to the Jamaican people.
Well, let me kind of roll it back a bit, because you've kind of brought us right up to speed. But I want to go back to the point when you decided to do a master's degree. You know, when we first met, there was a kind of resistance there at first. And then suddenly you, in your master's degree, you became this, I would say, a thinking practitioner. You weren't just content to talk about practice. You actually started to think and you started to write. So can you talk to us a bit about one of the first turning points from practice into thoughtful practice?
I think for me, it was that you can kind of come from the street, come from an environment that individuals or people may deem as somewhat negative, but make great out of a situation. So for me, I had to prove to myself that I can be a practitioner, be myself, have my personality, but also be a thinking person. From when I came from the community going into academia, there's this narrative amongst people from the ends that when you enter into a white institution, that you're somewhat going to sell out, you're somewhat going to lose yourself. But then going through that educational process, one thing that I learned was you don't have to use those narratives in terms of contextualizing. University, for me, and what it did for me, was enable me to critically analyze my situation, critically analyze what I've seen going on in my community. So from a critical thinking perspective, that's what the master's degree did for me. So as I was able to then make that entrenched in terms of what I did, I noticed that I had an edge about me, and that edge was being able to walk into any space where there was a well-known gunman or a well-known individual from the community known for the negative things, and then be able to walk straight into an academic institution and articulate myself in a way in which individuals that possibly don't have access to those communities are able to do so.
Yeah, well, you think that, I mean, I think it's commendable that you've done that. But do you think it's possible to create a whole generation of people that from the community that can go into academia?
Most definitely. And, you know, I don't want to say all of the names of those people because they might cost me on the Facebook Live. But, you know, I'm working with, you know, some interesting students, you know, currently doing their third year, and they're sharp. You know, I'm talking about people that come from the hood. I'm talking about individuals that have been through some trials and tribulations and some real crazy things that we might read about sometimes in the paper, and their families are also affected, whether it's murder, whether it's violence, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's rape, whether it's paedophilia. No matter what it is, I have some sharp thinkers that are thinking, even now, how do we translate what we know into the streets?
But let me come in there a minute. Historically, traditionally, academia is in this country, it's a white privileged environment.
Mm-hmm.
There's diversity on many levels, but it's still white privileged.
Yep.
Let's say you had a scenario where you get people from the streets, the community. I mean, those people there, those sharp people that you've talked about. What is the consequences of the orthodoxy in academia having to deal with loads of people like yourself going into very conservative white spaces?
I mean, the consequence ultimately is, one of the things is definitely perception from the community for those that don't understand that process, and those that are from a vantage point where they think that they know or they have something to contribute but haven't really reflected or critically reflected on what that means in real time. So the consequence for some is always going to be the perception of what other individuals and maybe black people in the community think about them going through that transition. But in real time, you find that these are the individuals that are often in the community actually making the real change with the communities that these individuals with the perception assume that they can engage and they can't.
The other day when you sent out a tweet and you talked about bridging the gap. When you look at it on the surface, it kind of makes sense. You go back to the 40s, the Chicago School of Sociology, Stuart Hall, Centre for Cultural Studies. You know, so there's movements. Would you say that at the moment, in terms of what you're saying then, are you advocating in bridging that gap in terms of the streets and academia, more of a revolution inside academia, or are you saying that it's a very gentle journey? Because
I think it is a gentle journey, and it's bringing back the old school in terms of how we approach these institutions. You know, you can be a unique self without having to sell out, and you can be an academic at the highest level. Because the reality is, when I go back to the hood, no one don't see me as an individual with a master's on a PhD program. They see me as C, the brother from the gym, my man that's helped me with that situation, or a parent might see me as an individual that's helped their son in prison or their daughter going through a particular situation. So for me, again, that goes back to perception. That perception for me doesn't bother me, and that perception doesn't stop me doing what I need to do. So when I enter into an institution and the obstacle might be other individuals might box you in that particular space, that's what drives me to do a bit more. So I'll do extra articles, I'll do extra lessons, I'll do extra things in the community, I'll do more parenting programs, I'll help more brothers in prison, just to demonstrate the fact that we can be our unique self and not have to sell out to whatever narrative or any perception that somebody wants to box us in that particular space.
So let's say you're a cultural broker who's an academic, bridging that gap. What about the individuals that look like us, are in academia, who like the fact that they're not part of the community? They have a kind of authentic space where basically they're in there, they're disconnected from the community. How do you feel, how do you navigate that? How do you navigate that space where they're making resistance from black people to see more people from the community who get PhDs or masters occupying that space? Because that white privileged space at times can only accommodate a small amount of diversity, contrary to what people say.
And I think that is the challenge that we'll forever go through throughout the times in history. There's always been individuals that look like us, or sometimes try and speak like us, and oftentimes are not for us. So for me, this is what I go back to, this whole concept about my unique self. Because when I step into those types of environments, you quickly see the difference. Because for me, it's about the portfolio. And what I mean by the portfolio is that anybody can, you know, sit down and write a piece of paper and talk about an issue. But for me, what are you doing with that issue? And that's what I mean by having that edge through the point I just made earlier. So I can go into that space where those individuals dominate, or sometimes individuals that are in a comfortable position. Again, I'm always going to be perceived as a threat, and individuals like myself are going to be perceived as a threat. And I need people to understand that that is going to be a challenge, but that doesn't stop me from being who I am. And I think that is what the streets is. Well, the streets makes you uncompromising. The street sometimes makes you radical. The street sometimes makes you an individual that, you know, despite what people say, despite what the haters say or think, you're still going to be me. So when we're talking about the portfolio now, and you ask the question, well, what have you done? You're able to demonstrate on many different levels where those things have done, because regardless of what anybody says on a book or a piece of paper, the fact is, when a man's getting locked up and about to serve life in prison, there are only a few people in that courthouse that is going to support that family. When a youth gets shot or stabbed in our community, the reality is there's only going to be certain types of people around those individuals helping them deal with that particular problem. So you either can theoretically break that down, or you're going to be an individual in the community that supports that. I'm saying that I'm occupying a new space and inviting people to join that space where we're able to do both.
Right. When I was in Jamaica, the one thing, when I was in Jamaica, sorry, when you was in Jamaica, I noticed when you spoke, and what came up is the word doctoral student. When you think you've enrolled on the PhD, you're embarking on intellectually one of the most challenging journeys that you can face. I mean, it's very challenging. So when you think about your manifesto for bringing people into this space, what's your initial thoughts about managing the doctorate? Is there any thoughts in your head where you think there's going to be some challenges and maybe I have to modify my position? Or do you feel right from the outset that the PhD, the doctoral journey, in no way is going to inhibit or change who you are?
I don't think the doctorate study is going to change who I am in terms of my personality and my characteristics. But what it's supposed to do is change my thinking, which is when I met you and my master's degree did. It enabled me to change from the perspective of a young black male from the community, from Hockley, and entered into an academic institution and never seen a black academic with a black mind. So for me, I look at the PhD process as a sponge. So I've got an excellent supervision team, Dr. Mohammed Rahman, Dr. Imran, Awan, you know, other individuals that are going to be supporting that process, including yourself. So I look at that as I want to be a sponge amongst all of you guys, so you kind of do to me what the masters did, but at a different level. So you're framing or helping me frame the way I perceive violence, the way that I engage with violence, the way that I understand the root causes of violence, the way that I understand the impact of violence on race, culture, gender, ethnicity, and all of the issues that we hear about in society. So for me, the whole PhD process from my perspective is going through that process and developing my mind so I become a scholar in the community in a particular way.
One of the things you talk about bridging the gap, and obviously as you journey through this, academics will be engaging with you in a space that academics are familiar with. How do you intend to bring the community through the changes that you're about to embark upon? The reading, the theorising, the demands of a PhD. How are you going to maintain that link and that connection with your loyal followers who are having to face the fact that in a few years' time you'll be Dr. Craig, Dr. C. So what's your strategy alongside your own intellectual growth?
My strategy is exactly the same, and the strategy isn't one that I'm going to shift from. I still got all my people on WhatsApp. I still got all my people on social media platforms, which I get to engage with thousands of people through social media platforms. But I'm also an individual that is from the community. I go to the ends every day. A PhD is not going to stop me from going to the ends. So a PhD is not going to stop me from going to a food shop. It's not going to stop me from going to get my chicken and rice from a stop. It's not going to stop me from being me.
It all sounds good and it all sounds positive and productive, and I understand that. So if that's the case, then on paper you shouldn't have any fears, anxieties or worries. So is there?
I have loads. And
well, let's unpack.
I've mentioned the reality is that I've had an issue with dyslexia, and I used to run away from that, but I don't run away from it no more. But it's still a fear. I know that my supervisor sends me loads of articles, and I'm trying to understand theories. I'm trying to understand methods of engaging with some of the things that I'm going to be looking at in terms of my study, and I can't get my head around it. So what I do is I develop what we call coping strategies. So I have to make sure that I'm on a Thursday morning, Saturday morning, I'm in the library with all my notes, and I'm making sense to the madness. I have to do that all the time. I have to check in with you. Does this make sense? I have to check in with Mo. Does this make sense? I have to phone Tanaya. I have to phone a certain person. I have to phone Joan. Is this making sense? I have to phone Mpumi. Is this making sense? So again, the concept of the sponge. The sponge is something that is dry. I'm dry. And I want it to be wet. And I want that to be wet with knowledge, skills, wisdom, and experience, and life experience. So whilst that is being wet in terms of my mind from a analogy perspective, I ain't trying to lose everything else that's in there. So, I ramp with my youths, I ramp with the man them from the ends. I have my WhatsApp groups, and I live by that because for me, that's what keeps me sane. I need to have my group where we're in the gym talking about foolishness. I need to have the group where we're just talking about all kind of madness. I need to have the group that talk about, you know, academics. I need to have the group that enables me to think a little bit different. And for me, that's what makes me me. So with the process, I'm not in fear about going through it. What I'm in fear of is, am I going to be able to do it? And I think my process, I trust the process now, because I've got a very good support network that, despite how hard I know that this journey is going to be, I've got a team that I know is going to enable me to get through.
If you, as I said previously, most academic institutions in this country are based on white privilege.
Mm-hmm.
What is your strategy going to be to bring in that white privilege into that space so that they're introduced to your world, your way of being, as a site, say, scholar activist?
Mm-hmm.
What's the strategy for bringing in that privileged position who may be fearful and frightened, resistant to change? Because if you're bringing the streets to academia, how do you intend to bring academia to the streets so that if you're solid in the middle, they're coming here? How do you do it the opposite way around? Or what's the strategy?
I think that the strategy that I normally employ is one of conversation. I immerse myself amongst individuals that the community may think are dangerous. So I don't share the things that I do behind closed doors, but I'll have a one-to-one with an individual in his car, and I'll be reasoning for hours about issues, things that have happened on the club in the weekend, you know, issues that are potentially about to jump off in the community. And I look at that transition as an opportunity to give them concepts and ideas from my vantage point, but also learn from those particular individuals. And no different to when I bring you into the community and I put you with 8 men that are well known for whatever particular reasons. You're not able to have an intellectual conversation with them without holding the title Dr. Martin Glynn. So for me, it operates exactly in the same way. So I can be in a food shop and I can see 5 men that walk in and say, yo, Craig, what you're up to? Yeah, I'm at university and this is what I'm doing. And then that breakdown takes place. Where do these events take place? At a funeral. Oftentimes is the time when I see most of these young people or young men or young women that have these intellectual conversations with me. Where else do I see them? I might see a young man in the barbers. I might see young people in the barbers, and having those intellectual conversations, and then finding out 2 days later that the same night I seen that individual died. But the last conversation that I had with them wasn't about the road. It was about how I engage with young people and getting them to be inspired in so many different ways. So for me, when we talk about strategy, my strategy ain't no different from me bringing academia to the streets or streets to academia. I think it's about me and me remaining my unique self. So how you see me is how you're going to have me. And whether people like that or not, and I'll never shift or turn or change my ways in order to fit a narrative or fit a group of people in order to make them feel comfortable. I'm coming from a line of individuals that were radical in terms of their thinking. I'm talking like your W.E. Du Bois. I'm talking about your Dr. Francis Cress Welsons, your Dr. De Greys, your Frederick Douglasses, in terms of their thinking. And one of the things that I learned from these individuals, that these were uncompromising in terms of spaces. So for me, I'm not changing who I am in order to make other people feel comfortable. So I want to box into an institution with my hat on. I'm going to come into the institution with my tracksuit on, because I'm not worried about what other people think about me, rather than what can I bring to the table. So when I see students and I see young people and I see parents and I see individuals from the community that say, you know what, Craig, you're doing a good job and you're doing well and thank you for the things that you've done. That's all I need.
Question. In light of that, I mean, you've written extensively around social media, the negative aspects of it. In terms of your growth and connectivity to the community, social media has been really important, connecting you. As you're journeying towards the doctorate, in an area of fake news and a lot of social media is coming under the attack, as a scholar activist, how important for new scholars is the way that they engage with social media as a platform academically?
But that's where it's at. I say it to people all the time, that that's where our young people are, that's where their minds are. Social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, is where they're spending a lot of their time. So we need to find a way to bring what we're talking about to them. No young person, unfortunately, is going to sit in no room for 2-3 hours listening to theoretical ideas and breakdowns of history. There are some people that are going to do that, but to the individuals that we call the hard to reach, the individuals that are on the block 24/7 because, you know, they need to put money in their pocket and they need to make sure that electricity and food is still running. I'm about how do we engage with those individuals. So I'll do things like this and I'll break it down in a 15-minute version and just give a man an idea. So a man will say to me in a inbox message like, yo, that was deep what you just said. I didn't even think of something like that. So for me, and talking to those individuals that are thinking about becoming like me and others in the community, it's about how do you keep your unique self and how do you sell yourself in terms of a social media platform.
If, let's go back to the early days of Public Enemy and NWA, both hip-hop, one represented political consciousness, the other represented gangster rap. When you look at the position you're occupying, if you was looking at Public Enemy and NWA, from your position academically, are you moving closer towards being a social media version of Public Enemy academically, or NWA? NWA brought the reality of the streets in one way, but Public Enemy brought the politicised element. Are you looking within it to bring the two together, or are you looking more towards the political side of it?
When we're talking about politics and bringing it to the streets and using the analogy, you know, Public Enemy and the NWA, the rawness that Public Enemy had anyway, they had that rawness. The only difference is that one projected a narrative that for many felt that was degrading to black women, the violence that was projected, and even though it was a narrative that took place in the community, to hear it that had a negative impact on the way that we perceive certain things. So, you know, you hear the narrative of, you know, that was the first time that someone said, I want to kill. That's the first time someone said on a platform that a woman is a bitch. And speaking about women in that particular way, that yes, it was radical revolutionary from a youth perspective, fighting a system that said that, you know, black men, black women were A, B, C, and D. Public Enemy had a different type of narrative. So when I look at myself, I'm saying I take the rawness without selling myself out to other people, because if you look at it from a recording perspective, that didn't benefit our community. That didn't benefit our community talking about selling drugs, even though it was a real narrative. So I'm all about telling that true narrative. I'm all about talking about the rawness and the reality of the streets and what's taking place in those places. But for me, it's about, well, how do we solve the problem in terms of the narrative that's been projected that oftentimes will draw some individuals into behaving or believing that that is their destination and that is the only outcome of a particular system that has been set out for them.
When I did my doctorate, I was very heavily influenced by African American academics, Caribbean academics. And one of the most interesting developments for me is the evolution of grime, which said, we don't want to be like African American rap artists. We don't want to be like Caribbean. We want to speak with our voice in a context in which we relate to. Would you say much the same as like the evolution of grime, that what you're talking about is establishing an identity for academics that is black, British, urban, that is informed by African American and all the others, but something is happening where we're establishing a new sense of identity which is rooted in this context?
I think very much so. I think that's what for me it's all about. Drawing on and standing on the shoulders of the scholars that have come before us, and bringing something new to the table. We ain't in Compton, we ain't in New York, and we ain't in Chicago. We're in Hockley, we're in Vincent Green, we're in Newtown, we're in Aston, we're in Moseley, we're in Shardend, we're in Chelmsley Wood. So the narrative may have similarities, but the way in which we see the issues sometimes is very different, and it's going to require individuals that have the same intellect of those that we look upon from America, from the Caribbean, but bring that into a context which we can understand from our vantage point. And I think that's what's important. So what we do and what we represent is that thing that we're about. We can be intellectuals, we can be our own selves, we can be true to our African Caribbean identity, be able to articulate a voice. So when young people then want to then come forward and be able to do some of the things that we do, they then stand upon our shoulders. So I look at that as a thing that I learned from you, I learned from Ray, I learned from other people that have done excellent things and also made mistakes. And I build myself based on that because and that is the rites of passage of African-centered learning. You stand on the shoulders of those in the past, I stand on your shoulders, and that is part of the legacy. So when I'm talking and having these types of discussions, I expect, and this is how I talk to my students, this is how I talk to people in the community, I expect you to be better than me. I expect you to write more than me. I expect you to theorize more than me. I expect you to be more internationally known than me. Why? Because I acknowledge that there's individuals that possibly don't have access to me that are probably looking at me as a role model, because there's probably men that are in prison right now watching these types of things thinking, you know what, when I come home, I want to change, but I don't know how. So it's about, well, how can we find the realistic ways of being your true self, but also bringing in your intellect and finding a way that you can project that in a society that oftentimes tells you that if you think like that, you behave like that, and you look like that, then you're kind of not a real academic.
Shamaruna, famous criminologist, recently wrote an article in the Irish Probation Journal calling for reformed offenders, people from the community, basically arguing that desistance needs to start and end in the community. Mm-hmm. But he says to do that, there needs to be the basis of a new social movement like the civil rights movement. Now, when I'm listening to you speak, it seems very much like advocating a kind of movement. Because if you're bringing together people that are not normally brought together for social justice, the initial impetus is like a movement. So would you also say that in bridging the gap, that the academic that comes from the community who straddles both has to also operate as a leader? Mm-hmm. And I don't mean leader in terms of like elected leadership, but has leadership qualities to bring people, to incentivize them as a collective.
It's imperative. I think it's imperative.
Well, can you talk a little bit about what are the implications and consequences in terms of the orthodoxy by bringing a movement?
I think ultimately there's going to be sacrifices, and it's one of those things where I've always said, and it's something that you taught me, that it's not about sometimes how many people you engage, rather the quality of the impact that has on the people. So for me, I know that sacrifice has always been a major issue in terms of my journey. I've lost friends, I've lost close ones. I've had individuals that drop off. I've had individuals that claim that they're going to be around and don't stay. So I realise and recognise that that's always going to be a consequence, that I'm losing good people, and not sometimes by the wrong reasons, but just because sometimes people don't get the process. It's not a quick fix. Working in community, working with death, destruction, chaos, upset and trauma is a long life journey. So it's going to require individuals that are resilient. It's going to require individuals that are uncompromising. It's going to require individuals that are prepared to be broke. It's going to be individuals that are prepared to do the unthinkable. And I think if I can demonstrate that through my practice, and I've been out here 14 years, and people have watched the development of doing that, individuals can watch myself and others that are in the community doing similar work and say, you know what, I can do it. And that's what I mean by building on them shoulders, so I can capitalise in terms of the strength of what this man or woman's doing, but I'm not going to do those types of things.
Let me ask a difficult question. Over the weekend it was announced that the government is instigating a review in higher education. Mm-hmm. Because of Brexit, because of globalisation, because of like Donald Trump's America First. There's a move towards manufacturing, science, technology, and within this review, part of the talk is the validity of social science. Mm-hmm. Now, oppressed peoples tend to occupy space that requires addressing social problems. Mm-hmm. So the politics of it right now is there's a question, how relevant is social science as a discipline to study in bringing the changes that some people argue are purely driven by economics? So from your point of view, if we bring in a process which puts more emphasis on manufacturing, science and technology, and you're trying to build a movement of ideas, how do you navigate that conflict when we don't have resources. There's people out there who are rich. So in terms of being able to demonstrate the validity of social science that's rooted in an urban inner city context, one that we relate to, how are you going to be able to lay the foundation so that the politics of this doesn't push it away?
I think the foundation's already been laid. I think what it's about is adapting to the social environment and again not losing your unique self. So despite whether manufacturing technology and all those things come into existence, social media, perfect example. Social scientists probably didn't predict the way that social media was going to hit us with a storm, in a way in which young people are utilising social media to engage, the way that they're using those platforms to do a range of different types of things. But those that have done really well with social media have adapted to that particular process, but it hasn't stopped the theoretical breakdown of why individuals do what they do, because regardless if social media is here or not, we still have issues of poverty. Regardless if social media is here or not, we still have issues around race, still have issues around gender, still have issues around corporate investment, we still have issues around lack of opportunity, lack of employment, mental health, disproportionate sentencing, disproportionate medication being given to specific individuals. So despite all of that, we have to still analyse and be able to define from a place where we're able to say that this is the core issue and we can respond to it. So when we talk about even things like, someone asked me yesterday, I said, Craig, you've been talking about this concept of a public health model and what does that look like in real time. I said, in order to know how to respond to the problem, we need to understand what the problem is. And people say that, yeah, we know the problem, but I question that. Do we really know the problem? In modern day times, so if you're using a theoretical perspective, and not even if it's a theoretical perspective, but if you have an opinion or a perspective that is rooted in 1930s Chicago or 1990s American psychology, 1991 or 2002 ideas of how we address history and culture and whatnot, in 2018 you're going to find yourself lost. So the foundation's there, but we need to find our way to adapt.
I'm just about to embark on getting involved with a major government review of the Mental Health Act. When I went to 10 Downing Street, there was a guy there who'd been incarcerated. He'd been in mental health establishments for many, many years. And one of the things that came out from service users in the conversation is that in 40 years, hardly anything's changed. From your point of view, as you're about to embark on this journey then, to that you from Newtown and Hockley and wherever, who's exasperated, who's frustrated, who's watching his family members get locked up, and his family, or the father who's just lost his job and he might start taking crack, or the negative side of the way we feel. What are the 2 or 3 things that you've been wanting to say to those young people, to those disaffected people, about giving you the opportunity and space? Bearing in mind this journey, as I said, it's not for the swift, it's for those who can endure. What would you want to say to those exasperated individuals about why they should listen to what you've got to say when some of the evidence is very little's changed? What would you be saying to them?
I think for me, it's starting from a point of being realistic. And yes, the reality is that things don't seem like it's changing on a macro level, but let's just look at things from a micro level, that things have changed, the way that certain youths behave, the way that certain people behave. So for me, it's not about oftentimes bringing forth solutions. Sometimes it's about raising questions. So when parents come to me and they have those types of conversations about, well, nothing has changed, I get them to look at things from a different perspective. So maybe it's not changing the way in which you want to see change in terms of, violence within a particular community, but it's more about, well, how do we teach our children to more stealth in our community, that they can become almost like individuals that are able to navigate in a situation where might be potentially violent and they lose their life. So perfect example, working with a young man, he feels that his life can be lost at any moment, talking about a situation that he was involved in before the Christmas break, and feels that if he sees these particular individuals that he feels that they're going to stab him up and take his life. So my reality was different. This was the real conversation, and again, it's about being real. So the reality, and I said to him, is that, you know what, I can't stop the fact that these young boys might see you and might trouble you. But for me now, it's about, can I give you ways in which you can navigate your way through the community and you're able still to get your education. This is a young man that wants to be a businessman. He's still at college, doing his thing, and he hasn't given up on that. So his resilience for staying in education, I enhance that, but also talk about his public safety. So we look at, how do you catch the bus home? Where do you chill on the weekends? What type of people are you moving with? So the process isn't about the wider change of stopping the violence, but it's more about keeping him safe. So if I can give him the knowledge, tools and skills that keep him safe from Monday to Sunday, reality is that there's no guarantee, but the longer that those situations are taking place, whilst there's mediation taking place with individuals that might be the culprits of those types of behaviours, then that's how I see change in the community, because what it's doing is it's encouraging other individuals like myself to not talk about, how do we stop the problem, but how do we reduce the violence? I've always been from that angle and argument that even in the communities, when you speak to individuals that talk about gangs of violence, and a lot of people don't agree with my concept, but it's my concept. And my concept is that I don't have an issue with gangs. Never had an issue with gangs. My issue is the violence. So if I can try and engage and reduce the violence at, whether that is at a community level or at a systematic level, then maybe I think that's where my energy is best spent. If I can try and safeguard young people to the best of my ability and train individuals in the community that essentially can do the things that I'm doing, then for me that's the process, and for me that's the legacy of at least what I'm trying to leave.
Let's say Monday morning, there's a few of us in a room. You've got a teacher, a social worker, a criminologist, a theologian, a sports person. You're all sitting in the room and you're all discussing that same about a solution. How do you bring people who operate in silos, who operate from a different discipline, how do you get them to come up with a common purpose? Because historically, when you look at the evidence, is that we all cling to our discipline. So although we say we're about saving the young, the question is, with yourself and this rallying cry, because we're talking about youths and people who are broken and disaffected, who need support. So if you put them to one side, those of us who are professionals in inverted commas, those of us who have the knowledge and the wisdom and the insight, who at times are resistant to engage in community. In terms of your journey academically then, how now do you feel you're going to be able to bring those together under a common purpose so that we can focus collectively on that one young person as opposed to 8 people trying to get that person individually?
I think that has already been established in the community. However, this is my critique to myself. It's not done on the scale in which I would like it to be. So,
what scale would you like it to be?
I'd like it to be a city-wide scale, or even a national scale, where we really truly adopt a public health model from a community perspective, looking at Shad Maroon, talking about the idea about reducing issues of violence, and it has to be community in the beginning, it needs to be community in the end, that it has real stakeholders that are invested in the community. And what I mean by that is that there are going to be individuals that come to the table, that act, that pretend, but oftentimes that gets seen through their actions based on what they do. So when you look at Chicago, when you look at Baltimore, when you look at places like New York that have established them types of ideas, the people at the table generally tend to be people that are really out there in the community, and the community know who the real workers are. The community know who those individuals are. I don't know, there's no illusion. Anybody can't when you're from the hood, you can't act in the community and act like you're somebody that you're not. You'll get exposed in a second. That's what I love about the community. So if you're an individual that's in the community acting like you're someone that is for the community, or acting like you're a voice for the community are very interesting and very beautiful in the sense that they make you know your reality and they humble you. sometimes. So for me, creating a platform or creating a system, maybe at the end of this journey, at the level in which I would like, is to get true stakeholders at the table, and a process in which that is informed by research, that is also informed by frontline workers that are prepared to take some of those or make some of those sacrifices, like many of us have. Then I can see changes happening, and doesn't necessarily on a macro scale, but in terms of reducing some of the violence that takes place in our community, definitely. But there's so much work that needs to be done with not just young people, but there's so much work that needs to be done with parents. There's so many work that needs to be done with mothers in isolation. There's so many work that needs to be done with fathers in isolation. There needs to be more work that's done with mothers and fathers, stuff that's done with the elderly, intergenerational work that needs to be stuff that takes place with young women, work that needs to take place with young men, young women and young men together. Professional practice has always proven, based on the research, that research is poor. So sometimes we talk so much about the kids and the youths and the violence that takes place in the community, but very little about how crap teachers are, very much how crap some youth workers are, how crap individuals in position that are getting paid 30, 40 grand a year to sit behind a table and act like they're doing something, and in reality are not being held accountable. So for me, that stakeholders will be able to civil out some of those individuals that are faking it to make it, and then put the young blood that's in there. And that's why I always talk about building on the shoulders, and I'm prepared at any point in time that when I feel that my time is up, then I'm prepared to step to a side, and I'm confident to step to a side and make the next generation or the next buck to come in and, you know, provide that, because that's what you did for us. And I think if the more we do that type of stuff, when we're talking about African-centered rites of passage and passing forth that knowledge of wisdom, education and legacy, that's what I then hope to put out for the community.
I mean, what you're describing is a word what we call generativity. Generativity is where the older generation take responsibility for passing it on. One of the things I've learned as I've got older, and it's a question I want to put to you. Mm-hmm. One of the things I don't think a lot of people understand with academic study is the level of emotional investment. On the streets, there's a level of physical risk, emotional engagement, psychological energy that gets taken away. So one of the things that would be good from a reflexive point of view, in terms of you looking at you as a human being, what safeguards are you building in for your own well-being? Because obviously, with the passion, the energy, but as a father,
I always make sure that I strike my balance.
And can you talk a bit, because there's going to be people listening.
Yeah, and I think for me it's always striking that balance. You know, a lot of people that know me know that I've had breakdowns, I've had to go to hospital, I've had, you know, organs removed. I've went through the trauma of not listening to my elders, my mentors, when they talk about this concept of burnout, that you do so much emotionally, physically with the people that you don't have the time to detach. So for me, I just try that balance now, making sure I'm always training and make sure that I do things on the weekend. I always make sure that I have that vent or people that I can vent to. You hear me talk about the WhatsApp group. For me, the WhatsApp group for me is my vent where I can bust joke, I can do things, I can act like a kid, I can do all of the things that sometimes the community just want you to be, you know, sometimes they want you to be serious 24/7. And that's why I like to put humour and bust joke. A lot of people that know me, I'm always running joke, I'm always doing silly things. But if they don't know me, they just look at you as an individual that works in the community, that does a certain type of job. But I do so many other things now to make sure, and since that particular time where I've made those changes and created that balance in life, I haven't been back to hospital.
Well, let me ask you a question. As we're trying to get into the closing point, what would you say one of your favourite words is? Is it peace? Is it harmony? When you look at a word that you would love in our community at some stage in the future, what would your favourite word be that you like to say to people? This is the word that I love. Greatness. You know, what is your favourite word?
I think for me, real. Just be who you are. Don't compromise yourself. Keep your integrity and be you. I think there's nothing for me more realer than real, and I think that's how I try to be. You know, I don't try to be or act as if something that I'm not. I'm humble enough to say how I've come. I'm humble enough to say who's brought me here. And I'm still humble enough to now to say who I'm getting help from. So other individuals that are looking at individuals like us don't come in with this concept and idea that they know it all, because none of us know it all. And I'm humble enough to be able to show people that, you know, we can be real. So for me, that's what I always say around the people, and I hope that that's a projection that I give to the people, that I'm 100% real. And if I don't project myself as someone being real, then check me, you know. And I, you know, I said I'm from the block, so for me, it's normal for individuals to, you know, have an honest conversation and say, you know what, I don't respect that, I don't like that, because this is how I feel about that situation. And for me, those moments, and I've had them before with young people before and whatnot, and it's humbled me to make me think, you know what, maybe that was the wrong strategy that I used in that time and space.
We graduated on the same day.
Yeah.
You got the masters, I got the doctorate. And just as a kind of final question, in a few years' time, when you're standing with the gown on and you've got your doctorate,
mm-hmm.
and you're reflecting on this journey that you've made, that the academic journey finally comes to an end, what's the one thing that you'd want to say to yourself, projecting into the future once you stand on that finish line?
What would I say to myself in the future?
Yeah. The reason I'm saying it is because this will be on Facebook or will be captured. So whatever you say now, the moment you graduate with your PhD...
I think for me, it's just that you flipping did it. Is probably what I would say. Because it's real. I mean, I hope that when I finish my PhD, that they allow me to spend like £300 to ram out the building with all the mad dem, all the people from the ends, all the people acting like, you know, and just on some Wakanda forever, you know what I mean, just on some misbehaving, loud, boop, 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 just all of that going on in the building, because I, again, look at it as the community brought me here, the community allowed me to have the access, the community continued to bring me through, and at the end, the community is what I'm going to leave with. So for me, the greatest thing that I could do, and I hope that there's an opportunity to be able to do that, and I don't care how much they charge, that I can bring all the youths and bring, you know, some of the parents and get them to see that, you know what, this is a man that come from the block, 1-8, hot side, I came from there, and I became a PhD. And that's not to make anyone know. And I always say that, you know, rep your ends, but rep it good. You don't have to rep your ends for negativity. So I'm always known as the man that I rep my ends, but not in a way, in a light in which people would like me to rep it in that way. So you can rep something that is perceived as negative, and you can rep it in the right way. And I've always been that individual person from the ends that has always held that flag. You know, I'm from the block, and if I can boss international and have a doctorate, then it is what it is. So then hopefully when I'm there, you can now start calling me a master's student, and you now can say, you know, I'm Dr. Pinkney.
Yeah, we'll have to wait for that time to come. But finally, any kind of final thoughts as a kind of wrap up from this conversation, that, and I'm specifically thinking now, the man has just come out of jail after a life sentence. I'm thinking about the mother who's just found out that her son's gone. Thinking about the youth who's discovered his father's been locked away, to the thousands and legions. My students today, I made them have a 1 minute silence for the 17 people that were murdered, but I also made them 1 minute silence for that two youths that got hacked in Tottenham. And let's not forget, whilst we've been on air, people have been burgled, there's all sorts of stuff going on. So in terms of a kind of final parting shot to the listening audience, the people who are going to discover in you for the first time, what would you kind of like to say as a kind of parting shot?
I think for me, it's trust the process. And we have come from a line in a history of warriors, kings and queens that never struggled or never went through a struggle without ever thinking about the future and the end goal. So these are people that never gave up hope. These are individuals that never gave up the fight. in order for individuals like myself to be able to have the opportunity to be able to do other things that can contribute and support other people in the future. So the process is trust the process, trust the journey, and if I can be an individual or one individual from the community, or to the man them, you know, behind the gate, or a young man that's just come out of education, a young man that's thinking about going back into the education, or a young woman that's thinking about going through those things, that not so much if I can do it, you can do it, but you know what, it's going to take some real strength, resilience. It's going to take some hardships. You're going to lose friends, you're going to lose individuals that you consider family, but ultimately at the end goal, you want to continue that long legacy of individuals that were fighters on our behalf. So I'll just end with trust the process, keep it moving, don't forget who you are, don't lose your integrity, don't feel that you have to conform and change the way that you are, the way you look, the way that you behave, your personality, to make other people in society feel comfortable.
So in essence, you're going to be like an intellectual Black Panther coming from Black Under.
Now I'm just going to be Craig from the block in the end with a PhD, and it's just as simple as that.
Well, listen, Craig, it's been good to talk to you in reason. Don't punch my fist, man, because yes, man, the man's got a big fist. Listen, great to talk to you. So I just want to say this is Dr. Martin Glynn, aka Doc Martin, signing off with doctoral student Craig Pinkney, and I'll repeat, doctoral student Craig Pinkney. So it is. Thank you very much, and we'll talk again.
All right, peace.